All right, so now we'll turn our attention to the great playwright George Bernard Shaw, and we'll also look at the topic of the woman question, which is really the question at the center of this play. That's why I've paired the readings in that way. And Winston Churchill, the great British Prime Minister, called George Bernard Shaw, who actually lived until 1950, so through Churchill's lifetime. Churchill called him bright, nimble, fierce, and confident. This is a very apt description. Um, what's important to know about Shaw is he was born and raised in the Victorian period, and he was an important and engaged public intellectual, but his experience encompassed the momentous historical changes of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So he lived to be 94 years old from 1856 to 1950, which is quite old. And so he grew up in the Victorian period. So he saw all of those sweeping historical changes we've talked about. But he also lived well into the 20th century and saw World War I, saw World War II, and wrote for most of his adult life. So he began writing in the 1890s at the end of the Victorian period, and everything he'd seen growing up for the first 30 plus years of his life influenced his writing in the 1880s and 1890s, but then he continued to write into the 20th century, saw World War I and whatnot. And so we're looking at one of his very first plays, Mrs. Warren's Profession, a very Victorian play. But if you were to study more of his works, and the textbook points out all these famous works, famous plays he has in chronological order, you would see how similarly into the 20th century his works reflect what was going on then. And so he's not just witnessed these things, but he was a writer very concerned with social issues and very engaged with his reading public in that sense. And so he's a helpful writer. It's helpful to study him at the end of the Victorian period because through him we can see the changes from the Victorian period to the 20th century. In part because he made it his business to pronounce on all those social changes his witty epigrammatic style. So he was much the opposite of Oscar Wilde. They're both from Ireland. They're both playwrights who did a bulk of their work in Victorian London in the 1890s. They're probably the two most influential British playwrights since Shakespeare before Tom Stoppard. And so they have all those parallels. But if you remember from Wilde, he was the aesthete. He was the one who believed in art for art's sake. And even though we can read perhaps some very subtle social commentary and the importance of being earnest, Wilde was very much consumed with just having great dialogue, depicting great art. They fought over this. His fellow Irishman Shaw disagreed. He thought specifically the purpose of art was to make social commentary. And oh, does Shaw make social commentary? It all began in 1876. He'd worked in Ireland at a land agent's office since he was 15 years old. But he followed his mother, who moved to London to become a musician. He moved to London to become a novelist. None of his novels worked out. He was not a skilled novelist. But a journalist saw him in the British Library reading two books, Karl Marx's Das Kapital and Richard Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, which is an opera. Two texts that couldn't be more different in many respects, but so much show those two texts combined show what Shaw did with his literature. He believed socialism was the answer to all of society's problems, so he really bought into Marx's theories. But then he produced art, he produced plays. And so the reason why I say the Marx and the opera, reading both of those on the same day in the British Library just illustrates what Shaw's career was like, is he has art. He writes plays, he's writing art, but they're very much a mouthpiece for his ideas, for his social commentary. So he brings those two ideas together. How did he get from novel writing to playwriting? He was a big fan of Henrik Ibsen, who's the famous Norwegian playwright and probably the most famous playwright outside of Britain from the 19th century. And his journalism friend he met in the library encouraged him to go into journalism. So he started writing reviews of opera, and then he started writing reviews of plays. And then in the as the 1880s and 1890s, he started actually writing plays himself. So that's how the shift happened. Now, and we're going to move here and look at the woman question, which is the cultural context, contextual background for studying Mrs. Warren's profession. Um, Along with empire, the Victorian debate about gender is probably the most complicated question from the time period. So, what are some things that inform it? Well, one is ambiguity. There's not one clear definition, and this is reflected in Queen Victoria herself. We talked about Queen Victoria, how her name became an adjective, how it's really the best term to describe this period, even though she's technically a person, because she embodied the spirit of the age in her behavior. And so she's also a woman, right? So obviously important to look to her when trying to understand what the Victorians thought of gender roles. But she doesn't make it any less complicated. She illustrates the complexity of the woman question because she believed in education for women, which, if you go back to Wollstonecraft, 50 years before Queen Victoria, that was not the case, right? So that's a huge step forward. But she did not believe in votes for women, and women did not get to vote in England until the early 20th century. So right there, that shows the complexity, the contradictory, the ambiguous nature of gender roles for women in Victorian society. She also represented a very Christian view, which is that a woman should submit to her husband and have a hierarchical structure in the household then, and that this was divinely willed by God. And so that's certainly a view that many feminists, not all feminists, would disagree with because they're all different types of feminism. But again, complicates our understanding of femininity and societal expectations for women in the Victorian period. Um, the term submission is a complicated word. And this idea of submission within the household being divinely willed by God can be taken a lot of different ways. Some women, like Queen Victoria herself, didn't take it in a negative way. Victoria and Albert had a very happy marriage, and even if there was a hierarchical structure to their household, they very much collaborated on decisions, which is, if you look at the descriptions of submission in the Bible and in 1 Corinthians and other places, that's how it's described. But problem is the word submission can be taken many different ways, and therein lies the problem. And so some people actually argued that women were less intelligent than men. The textbook uses this example of the weight of the brain, which is just the most ridiculous example. Queen Victoria and her supporters would argue that the Bible argues that men and women are depicted as being equal in value, equal in intelligence, but that submission has more to do with roles designated by God. Whereas others took this idea of submission and ran with it in a much, much more negative way, making arguments like this. And when other Victorians, not Queen Victoria, but other Victorians are arguing that women are less intelligent than men, they're arguing for a non-biblical, very awful version of submission. I'm not saying the biblical one is correct or right. I'm just saying there's these different variations of submission, and some are much worse than others. There are also these books called conduct books, usually written by women. The prominent example in the textbook is by Sarah Strickney Ellis, describing how women should behave. And so that's problematic in of itself, but some of the conduct books even made this argument about women being less intelligent. And so you can really see where people like Wollstonecraft made their arguments. If women are already, if conduct books and two women are already setting up the situation this way, then women have no hope of achieving anything, and that's the problem. So these first few bullet points here, I hope, kind of lay out the context of what was going on. To sum that up, women, if they weren't valued for their intelligence, what were they valued for? Tenderness, unworldliness, innocence, domestic affection, submission. So women were meant to be pure, innocent, That was the expectation, at least during the Victorian period. And the term to describe that was angel in the house, which comes from Coventry Patmore's poem. And that's why I also assigned that for reading. Um, so there was this idea of separate spheres. Um, with capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, people began to see the social sphere or the market sphere outside the home as not pure innocent or as corrupt, and they believed women should not be tainted by that. So they thought women should stay in the home, and this view of women caused them to be worshipped, um, which is not a good thing because that creates idealization and doesn't lead to someone being valued or treated as a human being, but as an object for worship. And so this is very problematic. It also was not, although it may have been the majority, it was certainly did not constitute what life was like for all women, because at least one quarter, 25% or more of England's female population had jobs. Factory workers, farm laborers, prostitutes, those are just a number of examples. The commonality you'll see is these are lower working class jobs. So it was mainly middle class and upper class women who were the angel in the house. And as we know from our previous lectures, Victorian society did not treat the working and lower class well. And so life was rough in the working class for women, but 25% of the female population was there. And so now you're starting to see probably the connections to Shaw's play here and why many of them would turn to prostitution, considering the alternatives. So there's little encouragement for serious studies or artistic endeavors. So if women were at home, many of them had free time on their hands, um, because it's not like today if you have um, a woman who makes a choice to raise children and stay home with them rather than say sending them to daycare or something like in the 20th century 21st century. Here you had governesses and other servants who would actually do all the cooking and cleaning and raise the children and educate them. And so middle class and upper class women had all this free time. But because of this negative association with the public sphere, they weren't encouraged to pursue much education beyond the basic education or to go in, unless you grew up in like Christina Rossetti's home, to go into art or to do deep intellectual studies. And so it was really confining and restricting. Again, this whole separate spheres thing meant there were very few jobs women could do that were respectable. And so for these middle upper class women, if their families hit hard times, they had financial issues, they became governesses, which was like this kind of odd position where you basically became responsible for the education of someone else's children. So it was one tiny step above the jobs mentioned above as part of the working class, but um, it was just barely above that, and it was this odd kind of position where you're basically raising someone else's children. And so, because it was still within the home, it was considered an acceptable job for middle upper class women if their family fell on financial hard times or they did get a job. But it didn't really afford much opportunity for further education for themselves or any kind of significant artistic endeavor. And a number of novels dealt with um, the topic of being a governess. The best example is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which you should definitely read at some point. The final idea I want to introduce here is the concept of the new woman. So this came about in the 1890s, and it was the idea of a woman who was confident and assertive and didn't follow all of these things above, who got an education or produced art or went out into the world and did some kind of works. A woman who was independent and autonomous from the angel in the house standards. What is unfortunate is the textbook points out there was kind of a negative stereotype that went along with this, where uh, there were three things that appeared in every image of the new woman: bicycle riding, cigarette smoking, and wearing pants, which I'm sure many new women did those things, but there's certainly much more to being a new woman than those things, and that didn't define it. Being confident, assertive, independent, and autonomous, and usually achieving something artistically, economically, professionally, um, that's more what the new woman was about. But it became almost more of an image than a real person. And Shaw's play Vivi is an example of the new woman. And there were many new woman novels in the late 1880s and 1890s. So hopefully this paints an even better picture in your mind than what you had before of gender roles in the Victorian period. Um, People love to talk about them. The Victorians love to write, and that's where the term the woman question comes from, because all of these things were hotly debated in the presses and in literature. Let's turn to Shaw's play now and see how it so well encapsulates the crisis that women faced by just being a woman in the Victorian period. So there's two things I want to look at with Shaw's play. One is his theory of drama, what he believed drama should be, and the other is his defense of prostitution, because that's really what's at the center of his play. So the main thing with his dramatic theory is that the discussion overspreads and penetrates the action until it finally assimilates it. And so what this means is that the play has a narrative, a plot, and moves forward, but what the characters are discussing becomes ultimately more important than that. And so really Shaw's plays, they're not narrative driven in this same way, say, Shakespeare's plays are. They really end up becoming vehicles for characters to discuss social issues. His characters are mouthpieces for his social views, and he believed that was the purpose of drama. Like I said, that's where he diverged from Wilde. He believed the purpose of drama was social commentary. His other idea was that the play makes the spectators themselves the persons of the drama, so that old stage tricks are not necessary for audience engagement. I apologize if something just interfered with the recording here from my phone. I'm using headphones to record this, and I apologize if you heard that. Um, uh, Sorry about that. So, um, what this means is, to put it simply, is basically just that Shaw believed his plays were so engaging that the audience was just enraptured in them. Because drama existed for a long time, and it was something that was viewed by the masses before the middle and working classes learned to read and write. Um, so, along those lines, one of the ways drama was popular was it would use stage tricks to engage the audience. So, what I find interesting about this idea is that he believes his plays were so captivating that, just the play itself would draw in the audience. You didn't need any kind of stage trick. But his plays don't have a strong narrative. They're mouthpieces for his social ideas, as I mentioned just a minute ago. Whereas, Shakespeare would have, who's arguably the best dramatist of all time, would have a fairly complex narrative to engage the audience, or a really compelling protagonist. And his success as a dramatist was very much influenced by Sophocles' plays from ancient Greece in Plato's view of drama in the Poetics, which relies heavily on character and narrative. So, a question I would throw out to you is, how captivating do you find Shaw's plays? He's known for this beautiful, witty dialogue, and much like Wilde, his quotes are famous. Is that enough, though? Or do you need more of a narrative? Do you need a stronger character? The characters here are great and fascinating, but they're there to represent ideas about social issues. They're not necessarily there to just be a great character, say, like Hamlet or um, Cordelia and King Lear. So, anyway, Just a question to wonder. The other kind of piece of Shaw's thinking here I want to look at before we look at actual language of the play is his defense of prostitution. He has several commentaries, the textbook quotes that really outline his position, and that his position is then depicted in the play. So we'll see it in his words, and then we'll see it in the art, the literature, next. So he claims that prostitution was not caused by female depravity or male licentiousness, but rather by underpaying, undervaluing, overworking women so shamefully that the poorest of them are forced to resort to prostitution to keep body and soul together. So basically, the Victorian society treated its working class, and especially working class women, so poorly that prostitution was oftentimes the only alternative to starvation and death. And he's not exaggerating here. I mean, I think this part of his statement is accurate. He says it's not a defense of vice. He's not defending prostitution. He's defending the decision for a woman to choose to become a prostitute. Prostitution was called the great social evil. If you looked at that article in the woman question section that I probably should have assigned. And it was, I mentioned before, something Victorians just talked and talked and talked about in the press. And so it was seen as this morally reprehensible thing. He's not justifying prostitution from a moral standpoint, is his part here. What he's saying is starvation, overwork, dirt, and disease are just as bad as prostitution. So he's saying, don't criticize women, don't judge them, don't condemn them or shame them for becoming prostitutes until you've fixed everything that's wrong with society that forces them to become prostitutes, until you've given them an equal opportunity to get legitimate work. And so he's saying Victorian society did not do enough to stop the starvation, the overwork, the dirt disease, the underpay, the undervaluing, the overworking. They did not do enough to stop those things, but they still focused on all this energy on critiquing prostitution from a moral standpoint. And that's the hypocrisy, that's the problem. So these are Shaw's views of drama and his views of prostitution. Let's see how they appear in the play, Mrs. Warren's Perfection. So we're going to look at 3 quotes here. First, from Act 1, you have this discussion between Mrs. Warren and Vivi, her daughter. And the mother-daughter relationship is really at the center of this play. That's what it's really about. You have the men in the play, and they're there to provide a bit of a narrative. The relationships with the men provide just enough of a narrative to give the play a plot and move it forward. But what's really at the heart of the play is the relationship between Mrs. Warren and Vivi, and their conversations, when it's just the two of them, are what really bring out Shaw's ideas about prostitution. And so the dialogue between Mrs. Warren and Vivi are the most important. Those are the most important parts of the play, when they're speaking, just the two of them. And this really shows Shaw's theory. You start with this premise of the two of them reuniting when she's done with college, and she's perhaps maybe looking for a husband, and so you have a bit of a narrative there. But as Act 1 moves along, it eventually concludes with the two of them alone talking together at night. And so those narrative elements, as the men disappear from the scene, those narrative elements have kind of disappeared themselves. The discussion has subsumed the action, just as Shaw argues it should, and we now have 2 characters representing 2 different philosophies. That's the heart of the play. Mrs. Warren says, "Oh, I won't bear it. I won't put up with the injustice of it. What right have you to set yourself up above me like this? You boast of what you are to me, who gave you a chance of being what you are? What chance had I? Shame on you for a bad daughter and a stuck-up prude." So this is when Mrs. Warren is responding to Vivi's critiques of her decision to become a prostitute. So like many of Shaw's characters, Mrs. Warren and Vivi represent 2 sides of an argument. What's important here is they represent different definitions of femininity in the 1890s. So one way to look at the woman question is to say, how did women define themselves? Which is different from saying, how did Victorian society define them? And so, with the New Woman movement in the 1890s, you had, for the first time in the Victorian period, a number of women trying to strike out and define themselves. Unfortunately, Victorian society labeled them as the New Woman and continued to try to define femininity for them, but you still had instances of women trying to define their own role. And that's what both Mrs. Warren and Vivi do here. But they're depicting two different versions of femininity. They define themselves in different ways. And that's what Vivi sees that I think Mrs. Warren misses, is that they are similar in some ways, but they have these differences. They're not trying to carve out the exact same role. And so through these characters, then through their differences, Shaw's able to depict two different sides of this debate over prostitution. What they have in common is they both desire independence and autonomy from the rigid structures of Victorian society. They both want to separate themselves from the angel in the house model and strike out as their own unique woman. But the type of unique woman they each are is different. Mrs. Warren is a self made, outspoken person. She talks about how she can't in any way appear to be the angel in the house or appear to be part of Victorian society. She is just blunt. She's just going to say what she believes, and she believes most of Victorian society is pretense. There's the comparison to her sister, who was also a prostitute, but once she raised herself up through her economic success as a prostitute, then left the business and now is a lady in Victorian society. But she believes all of that Victorian society stuff is pretense, and her outspokenness, her bluntness, she can't be a part of that. So she's very much her own character. Vivi, on the other hand, Mrs. Warren believes is more like her sister. And Vivi is very much an example of the new woman figure. Mrs. Warren is really too old to be a new woman. And Vivi, she's young in the 1890s, she's educated, which was often something the new woman achieved. And so she wants to have her own career, whether that's artistic or business or something else. She wants to have her own career. She has an education. So she's this autonomous individual. But the key difference is she still has this moral code. She's still hanging on to some of the Victorian values, some of the Victorian attitudes toward prostitution. And that ultimately separates the two women, despite their parallel desire for independence and autonomy from many of the old Victorian ways. The key point that Mrs. Warren is making in this particular passage is that her way of life, so Vivi uses the word way of life all the time. And what I've tried to show them with the last couple bullet points is that they each have a different way of life, which is what Vivi's trying to show to Mrs. Warren. So the point Mrs. Warren is making her here is that her way of life, which Vivi disapproves of, has made Vivi's way of life possible. Vivi wouldn't have been able to go to school and get the education that makes her this new woman figure if it hadn't been paid for by Mrs. Warren's work as a prostitute and then brothel owner. So moving on, let's look in a little more depth at Mrs. Warren's defense of prostitution, which is basically Shaw's defense of prostitution. This is when her sister finds her working as a scullery maid in a bar. Her sister's When she saw I'd grown up good looking, she said to me across the bar, "What are you doing here, you little fool? Wearing out your health and your appearance for other people's profit?" Liz was saving money then to take a house for herself in Brussels, and she thought we two could save faster than one. So she lent me some money and gave me a start, and I saved steadily and first paid her back and then went into business with her as a partner. Why shouldn't I have done it? The house in Brussels was real high class, a much better place for a woman to be in than a factory where Jane got poisoned. None of the girls were ever treated as I was treated in the scullery of that temperance place, or at the Waterloo bar, or at home. Would you have had me stay in them and become a worn out old drudge before I was 40? So, what she's saying here, she's at the bottom of the working class, working in a bar, and she's basically being taken advantage of. Her employees are making a lot of money, but she's seeing none of it. And with prostitution, she could potentially make more money, make enough to say and raise herself up and become wealthy, which she does. And why shouldn't she do that? if she's, living in pretty much unbearable poverty anyway, being overworked and underpaid. Um, because Victorian society is not supporting women who are working in a bar or working in a factory to the point where they get poisoned and die. But Victorian men are going to prostitutes, and she can make her own money that way. So this is essentially the same argument that Shaw puts forth in his commentaries on prostitution, which we already looked at. But um, now you have them in a character in a play, expressed in art. And this is a turning point in the play, because at this point, Vivi sees the context and sees why her mother made the choice to become a prostitute and accepts it. So at the end of um, this might actually be Act 2. I may have put the wrong label there. I apologize. But at the end of this act, they become reconciled to each other. They embrace. And the next day, the men see them embracing. So it's a turning point. But that's not how the play ends. What happens next is Vivi learns that her mother is still running all these brothels throughout Europe. She's essentially the headmistress of a prostitution empire, and she's quite wealthy. And Vivi disagrees with this, and she eventually decides we have the opposite ending from the reconciliation we just saw. At the end of the play, she decides that they should part ways and not carry on together anymore. And this is incredibly saddening to Mrs. Warren. And the key differences in this line: you explained how it came about. You did not tell me that it is still going on. So at the end of Act 1 or 2, she accepts her mother, embraces her mother because her mother explains how she became a prostitute, and Vivi accepts that. But she says, "You did not tell me that it is still going on." And that's the line that shows, okay, this is the end of the relationship. And then she explains this in a little more detail. "No, I am my mother's daughter. I am like you. I must have work and must make more money than I spend. But my work is not your work, and my way is not your way. We must part. It will not make much difference to us. Instead of meeting one another for perhaps a few months and 20 years, we shall never meet. That's all." And so she first points out the ways that they're similar. They both want independence and autonomy. They need money for that, but work is important. Mrs. Warren, she has this prostitution empire now. She enjoys her work. She's not a prostitute anymore, but she's, a business manager, a successful one. It takes skills with finances, skills with interacting with people, and so it's stimulating work. And similarly, Vivi wants similarly stimulating work, whether that's in art or in business. And so that's an important aspect of how these two women are separating themselves from the rest of Victorian society. They want stimulating and fulfilling careers. The problem is there's this moral difference. She still doesn't approve of her mother's business, her mother's profession. And the reason is her mother doesn't need that profession. Her mother loves it and wants to keep doing it, but she needed it at first when she was a scullery maid and she was at the bottom of the Victorian working class. But now she's quite wealthy. She could go and do anything, but she wants to keep doing this thing Vivi sees as immoral. And that's ultimately why Vivi separates herself from the mother. And I think this is what Shaw was saying about vice. So Shaw said Shaw did not believe prostitution was morally acceptable, but he believed the choice to become a prostitute is morally acceptable in a Victorian society that offers no hope for its working class. And so I think Shaw's view is really present in Vivi at the end of this play. But I think it's more complicated than that, and this is one text I really wish we were meeting to discuss as a class. But I look forward to seeing what you think of it in the discussion. So I ask these remaining questions. Whose side do you believe Shaw would actually take? I mean, it seems like what Vivi says matches up to his beliefs, but he's very defensive of prostitution. And so, does Vivi have a solid moral point, Or is she stuck up and self-righteous? I mean, the answer could be both, right? But whose side do you ultimately take? Do you think Mrs. Warren provides a justifiable explanation for why she continues to run brothels? This is the type of work she wants to do and it's rewarding for her. Is that enough? Or do we have to consider this moral component? Finally, I think we can't overlook the fact that they're mother and daughter. I think as much as Shaw's characters are mouthpieces for his political beliefs, at the same time, I also think they are characters. You do have a drama here, and they are mother and daughter. So even if Vivi objects to Mrs. Warren's profession, does she have any kind of obligation to still be with her as mother and daughter? And this is complicated because there's also a question I didn't put on here of the fact that they've spent all this time apart. Vivi basically grew up without a mother while her mother was making all of this money. And so that's a question that needs to come into play too. So I think it's a play that really strikes to the heart of the woman question of the Victorian period, but poses more questions than it gives answers. And those are worth discussing further.